comes with human organs. Chicken sacrifices with a human heart. These things are going on. So the rumors are true, I'm gonna tell you that much.
Big realms, spiritual realms. There's good, there's evil, and they are slugging it out for the souls of mankind. And my question is, why are we even important? Little old flawed humanity, why are we important in that process?
Got it. You want this rewritten, tighter, cleaner, more cinematic, and sharper without losing the ominous edge. I'll keep it framed as analysis plus narrative commentary, not statements of fact, and strip the repetition while amplifying the spine of the argument. Here's a polished rewrite you can use as a long-form script or voiceover. Mel Gibson's warnings about Hollywood weren't just the rants of a man spiraling. To him, they were a map, a pattern, a system revealing how it reacts when a story threatens to step outside its control. When The Passion of the Christ went into production, Hollywood didn't just hesitate. It recoiled. Studios passed. Distributors mocked it. A violent, dialogue-heavy biblical epic in Aramaic and Latin was treated like career suicide. Too niche, too brutal, too sincere. Lightning cracked the sky during the crucifixion scene, striking Jim Caviezel mid-take, his shoulder dislocated under the weight of the cross. The assistant director had already been hit twice that week. Local crew members whispered one word: maledetto. Cursed. He funded the film himself, nearly $100 million, because he understood something Hollywood didn't. Resistance is loudest when something works. When the movie finally released, the backlash came fast. Screenings mysteriously disrupted. A bomb threat shut down a premiere. Critics dismissed it before watching. Over $600 million worldwide. The highest-grossing R-rated film of all time. And that's when the tone changed. Phone calls stopped. Meetings vanished. Agents suddenly had conflicts. The whispers began. Unstable, obsessed, dangerous. Not because he failed, but because he succeeded. He made a film that didn't just entertain. It forced people to sit with suffering, guilt, forgiveness. It converted attention into discomfort. And the stories from the set only fueled the mythology.
Now we should say that, remember, Diddy and his team were very upset when they found out that this footage was part of the documentary, and they tried to shut it down, but, you know,
the act of taping it is what
out.
is so
the
awful.
The act of taping it, right.
Without
Now,
Agnifalo's
Diddy would
knowledge.
say that I didn't authorize that video going out, and the argument they've made is that he's the one who has the right, that he owns that.
Actors arriving skeptics and leaving believers. Reported healings. Shared dreams. A serpent appearing on set during filming. Crushed by Gibson's boot without hesitation. Yes, he reportedly said when someone joked it wasn't in the script. It is. Hollywood didn't forgive him for that. Because Gibson's real offense wasn't faith. It was defiance. He refused to dilute the message. He refused to apologize for it. And the system responded the only way it knows how. Isolation, character destruction, narrative control. The same industry that once dismissed Gibson's warnings now finds itself managing another implosion. One far less symbolic and far more legal. Suddenly, leaked footage, competing documentaries, lawsuits surfacing after years of silence, family members scrambling to shape the story before the story shapes them. This isn't about comparing sins. It's about recognizing patterns. Hollywood doesn't operate on morality. It operates on order, on leverage, on knowing who to protect, who to sacrifice, and when the shield gets pulled away. The moment someone becomes more valuable as an example than as an asset, the machine pivots. That's the uncomfortable through line. Gibson challenged the narrative and was cast out. Others believed they were the narrative, until they weren't. Now the footage matters. The lawsuits matter. The documentaries matter. Not because they reveal truth, but because they decide who controls it. And that's the real question. When the system decides which secrets stay buried and which get aired for maximum damage, who's actually pulling the strings? The courts? The studios? The media? Or the men who spent decades learning how to play every side until the rules changed? If Gibson was right about the resistance, then this moment isn't an anomaly. It's the mechanism fully exposed. Not as judges, not as insiders, but as consumers of a narrative that's always curated, always selective, always serving someone's interests. The story isn't over. It never is.
Are you doing this with historians as well? Are you trying to make it?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, historical stuff. Well, I regard the Gospels as history. It's verifiable history. Some people say, oh, it's a fairy tale. He never existed, but he did. And there are other accounts, verifiable historical accounts outside the biblical ones that also bear this up, that yes, he did exist.
What makes Mel Gibson's story linger isn't the lightning strikes or the box office shock. It's what came after, the quiet part, the recalibration. Because Hollywood didn't attack the passion head-on once it succeeded. It did something more effective. It reframed the man. From that point on, every headline about Gibson stopped being about his work and started being about his instability. Context disappeared. Nuance vanished. Anything he said about faith, power, or the industry itself was pre-labeled as paranoia before it could be examined. The lesson was subtle but brutal. Make the message inseparable from the messenger's flaws. That tactic didn't start with him, and it didn't end there. Hollywood has always tolerated excess, violence, addiction, exploitation, so long as it remains profitable and controllable. What it doesn't tolerate is loss of narrative authority. When someone tells a story the system didn't authorize, the response is...
Yeah, because there's resistance, first of all, from secular Hollywood, where, for whatever reason, Christianity is the one religion that you're allowed to disparage.
Yeah.
Christianity is the one religion where people... all these progressive, open-minded, leftist people, they'll embrace all these different religions until it comes to Christianity.
It isn't censorship, it's contamination. Make the source radioactive. That's why Gibson's warnings matter now. Not because they were mystical, but because they described a process. And that last step? That's where things get ugly. Because selective exposure is where footage appears, lawsuits suddenly gain oxygen, and documentaries get greenlit overnight. Not to uncover truth, but to frame it. The public doesn't see everything. It sees what survives the filter. That's why the current wave of leaks, counter-leaks, and exclusive access projects feels less like justice and more like choreography. The timing is always too precise, the omissions too clean, the silence around certain names too consistent. This isn't to defend anyone. It's to point out something colder. The system doesn't act until acting becomes useful. For years, rumors circulate. Whispers bounce around green rooms and hotel suites. Everyone knows, but nothing happens. Then, one day, protection flips into prosecution. Not necessarily because the behavior changed, but because
One could watch this and think that you really hate Sean Combs.
Why would they be thinking that?
Because of the things that you post on Instagram,
Yeah,
because
but this,
of the...
Look at this. And let's stop for a second and do say that I hated him enough to hire his kids. And we've never done anything to each other. So it's just competitive energy and things that you say about other artists while you're in hip-hop culture.
He believed Hollywood resisted stories that forced confrontation, not spectacle, but reckoning. Stories where suffering isn't aesthetic, where forgiveness isn't ironic, where power isn't glamorous. Whether you agree with his spiritual framing or not, the pattern holds. Stories that threaten comfort are resisted until they can be neutralized. Neutralization doesn't always mean suppression. Sometimes it means weaponization. Footage becomes leverage. Silence becomes currency. Documentaries become legal chess pieces. Even family members get folded into the strategy, willingly or not. Legacy stops being inheritance and becomes liability management. And notice this, when the system turns, it never turns alone. Streaming platforms suddenly discover relevance. Sources appear, anonymous but conveniently placed. It creates the illusion of inevitability, as if this was always going to happen, as if the system is finally doing the right thing. But inevitability is often just coordination disguised as fate. That's the uncomfortable implication of Gibson's resistance theory. Not demons in a literal sense, but incentives, power structures, fear of uncontrolled meaning. Because once people start questioning why certain stories are buried and others are blasted everywhere, the spell weakens. The audience stops being passive, and passivity is the system's lifeblood. So when you see a downfall unfold in real time, complete with perfectly timed leaks, rival documentaries, and carefully edited emotional beats, the question isn't whether the subject is guilty or innocent. That's what Gibson was circling, even if his language made people uncomfortable. He wasn't warning about evil individuals. He was warning about a machine that decides when morality matters and when it doesn't. If narratives are curated and outrage is scheduled, and truth arrives only when it's profitable or strategic, then the audience isn't outside the system, reacting, sharing, picking sides, feeding momentum. So May.
I'm sorry, I'm just like really, I'm in this moment right now. This is crazy. Sorry. People don't really know how much what it does to you when something that you love is taken from you and thrown away like it don't even matter, and then they move on with their lives and you're stuck. You're stuck during those years. You're still stuck 21 years later.
All right, we go even deeper now. Slower, colder, less spectacle, more anatomy. This is the layer where it stops sounding like commentary and starts feeling like a postmortem of power. What people miss when they talk about Hollywood scandals is that scandals aren't accidents, they're releases, pressure valves. And pressure doesn't build unless something has been intentionally sealed for a long time. That's the part Mel Gibson was circling, even if he wrapped it in religious language. Because the system doesn't just decide what stories get told, it decides when silence becomes liability. For years, silence is protection. Then, without warning, silence becomes evidence of complicity. The switch flips quietly. Internally, by the time the public hears about it, the outcome is already shaped. That's why collapse always feels sudden, even when everyone claims they knew all along. The knowledge was never the problem. Timing was. Look at how these moments unfold. Not emotionally, structurally. First comes the pre-framing. Articles start resurfacing. Old interviews get recirculated without context. Past behavior is reinterpreted through a new lens. Nothing new is technically revealed, but everything feels different. Then comes the controlled leak. Footage, audio, documents. Not the whole story, never the whole story. Just enough to establish tone, enough to make denial look ridiculous and defense look strategic rather than sincere. After that, the parallel narratives emerge. Documentaries announced. Exclusive access. Competing versions of truth. All conveniently incomplete. This isn't chaos, it's containment. When there are too many stories, the audience stops asking which one is true and starts picking which one feels right. And finally, the moral repositioning. Institutions that once stayed quiet suddenly find their voice. Statements get released. Distances are publicly established. We didn't know, or worse, we're shocked. As if shock can.
And what's really going to be interesting is the parade of celebrities who we expect to be mentioned and or called into that courtroom. You know, people who we hadn't heard about prior, like Mike Myers, you know, Austin Powers, Mike Myers. Why is he getting called? Why is he on the witness list? That'll be fascinating. And then, of course, there are the no-name, quote unquote, women who are going to have to find every ounce of courage they have.
And when you threaten a gatekeeper's relevance, the response isn't argument, it's exile. Fast forward, and the pattern hasn't disappeared, it's evolved. Now, instead of suppressing stories, the system overproduces them. Instead of silence, it gives you noise. Instead of denial, it gives you curated outrage. The goal is the same: control the emotional endpoint. Because outrage burns fast, confusion lasts longer, and exhaustion guarantees compliance. That's why modern downfalls feel less like justice and more like theater. Everything arrives pre-packaged: villains, victims, timelines, expert opinions. By the time the audience enters the conversation, the range of acceptable conclusions has already been narrowed. And here's the quiet part nobody likes to admit. When the system turns on someone, it's rarely because it suddenly found a conscience. It's because the cost of protection exceeded the cost of destruction. That's why some people are shielded for decades and others are dismantled in months. That's why certain names are never mentioned, certain rooms are never described, certain transactions are never followed all the way up the ladder. Not because there's nothing there, but because pulling that thread destabilizes too many pillars at once. This is where Gibson's resistance language becomes less mystical and more mechanical. Resistance isn't demons, it's systems defending equilibrium. It's industries preserving mythologies that keep money flowing, and responsibility diffuse. It's the unspoken agreement that everyone benefits as long as nobody forces a reckoning that can't be neatly edited. And when reckoning does come, it comes selectively. That's not coincidence, that's sacrifice economics. So when families scramble to tell their version, when documentaries race court calendars, when footage becomes currency, what you're watching isn't truth emerging, you're watching power reorganize itself. And that's the final, uncomfortable mirror Gibson was holding up. Not that Hollywood.
So maybe the judge is going to give him more than time served. But we should say that the maximum he could get is 20 years. And that's what I want to get into for a minute. Because This is some racist you-know-what, this Mann Act. The Mann Act.
Which brings us back to the audience. Because systems like this don't survive on secrecy alone. They survive on participation, on our willingness to accept the version that arrives with the cleanest arc, on our preference for resolution over complexity. But real power never rolls credits. It just changes protagonists. So the question Gibson's story, and the current implosions echoing it, actually asks isn't who's guilty. Alright, we're going even further in, but now we widen the lens past Hollywood and strip away the personalities almost entirely. This is the layer where it stops being about people and becomes about infrastructure. Here's the part that rarely gets said out loud. Systems don't collapse from corruption. They collapse from loss of narrative coherence. Corruption can be managed, hidden, normalized, even monetized, is a story that exposes how the corruption is managed. That's when containment becomes urgent. Mel Gibson's real threat wasn't theology, it was orientation. His film forced the audience to look in one direction for too long. Suffering without irony, guilt without deflection, power without glamour. Hollywood thrives on motion, distraction, moral blur. The Passion stopped the camera and said, sit with this, because when an audience sits still, it starts asking questions that don't have convenient answers. And unanswered questions are radioactive to systems built on constant momentum. It learns that banning stories creates martyrs. Silence breeds curiosity. Suppression sharpens attention. So instead, it adopts a more advanced tactic. Flooding. But never all of it. Never the connective tissue. Never the full map. What you get instead is fragmentation. Isolated scandals that never quite converge into a systemic indictment. Each case feels self-contained. Each downfall feels personal. Each reckoning feels overdue but oddly incomplete. Because once blame is individualized, the structure survives untouched. This is why certain patterns.
But it just seems very suspicious when you go through and you look at in the history of different people that can make you go away if you know. Listen, I've worried about some of the things that I talk about on my show. Is someone going to knock on my door?
By the time the public sees the first crack, the decision has already been made. That's why the aftermath always feels theatrical, because the outcome is settled. What's being negotiated is the story. Who looks surprised? Who looks responsible? Who gets to say we didn't know with a straight face? And this is where the audience gets pulled in. We're invited to react, not to analyze. To pick sides, not to trace incentives. To consume updates, not to ask why those updates exist in the first place. And once justice is episodic, it stops being threatening. That's the final irony of Gibson's so-called resistance. The resistance isn't against faith or morality, or even truth in the abstract. It's against uncontrolled meaning. Against stories that don't end where they're supposed to. Against narratives that implicate more people than can be safely named. Because the most destabilizing idea isn't that bad things happen, it's that they happen with permission. Permission granted through silence, through contracts, through NDAs, through shared risk, through the understanding that as long as everyone benefits, no one asks the question that breaks the spell. Who else had to know for this to keep going? That's why reckoning is always partial. So when you hear that this time is different, it's worth pausing. Different outcomes don't mean different mechanics. Often they mean the mechanics worked exactly as intended. Which brings us back to the most uncomfortable place of all. Us. Because systems like this don't just rely on insiders, they rely on spectators who accept that knowing enough is sufficient, who confuse exposure with accountability, who mistake visibility for truth. And as long as the story feels satisfying, as long as someone is named, charged, disgraced, archived, the deeper questions never have to be answered. That's the real legacy thread connecting Gibson's warnings to now. But a structure that survives by deciding how much truth is tolerable at any given moment. And maybe the resistance Gibson talked about isn't just something Hollywood does to filmmakers or mobiles. Maybe it's something it depends on us not noticing. Because the moment we start asking who controls the story, instead of just consuming it, the machine loses its cleanest trick. And that's the one thing power never forgives. Push this even more philosophical. Turn it full investigative tone, or sharpen it into a closing monologue that hits like a warning bee retroactive. This is the system laundering its own history. That's the connective tissue between Gibson and now. Gibson wasn't punished because his film was violent. Hollywood has never had a problem with violence. He wasn't punished because it was controversial. Controversy sells. He was punished because he bypassed the approval process, financially, creatively, spiritually. He proved you could tell a story that didn't need their permission. As uniquely evil. Not that faith is uniquely persecuted, but that any story, religious, criminal, political, cultural, becomes dangerous the moment it removes plausible deniability from people who rely on it. Repeat across industries, decades apart, with different faces but identical choreography. Someone rises too high, accumulates too much informal power, becomes too independent of the formal gatekeepers. For a while, they're useful. Then they're expensive. Then they're dangerous. What's chilling is how impersonal that flip actually is. There's no meeting where someone says, "End him." It's subtler than that. Access tightens. Protection thins. Information starts moving sideways instead of up. Allies go quiet. Enemies get brave. The only thing that changes is who gets protected and who doesn't. All right, here's more expansion, deeper and darker, but still framed as pattern analysis, not declarations. I'll widen the lens, slow the burn, and lean harder into mechanism over accusation. But because the value equation did. At that moment, the same system that once shielded someone